Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Beautiful saints of God, as we come into the fifth Sunday in Lent, we are focused by our readings this morning on the mystery of what happens when our sin and our brokenness meets with God's grace and God's love. We are shown in the Gospel of John today some very important symbolism about this mystery of sin and grace meeting one another in the real time of our lives. We know that the Gospel of John speaks about life and death. The Gospel of John speaks about darkness and light. And the Gospel of John is there to point us to the true identity of Jesus, and in knowing Jesus, to know the true identity of God. So I want to take a moment and just unpack a little bit for us all the drama and the action that is happening in the scriptures that we have just read together today. The first thing we see is that the Greeks have come to ask Philip and Andrew that they want to see Jesus. The context here is that Jesus has already entered Jerusalem, and what the portion we read today is his very last public teaching before he enters the process of Holy Week. We have come to see Jesus, and in the Gospel, seeing is about believing, and so we see these Greek people coming and asking the question, we want to believe. But what is it that we are believing in? Because Jesus' answer is quite cryptic. He says, now has my hour come. The hour for which I have been brought into this life has arrived, the hour of my glorification. And so Jesus is pointing us to the truth of his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. And in doing so, Jesus is trying to say something very important to us here today. Jesus is saying that through my incarnating, through my coming into the world, God seeks to be with God's people, seeks to be with you in the places that you find yourself, seeks to be with you in your suffering, seeks to be with you in the places of brokenness in your life. Because sin in the gospel, sin in scripture, is anything that separates us from God. Sin is the breaking of our relationship with ourselves, with one another, and with God. And so Jesus reveals to us that in our brokenness, in the broken places of our lives, in our broken relationships, he is the one that is able to bring the grace that can restore us. And this is why the writer of Hebrews speaks about Jesus as our great high priest. And elsewhere, not in the portion we read today, we hear that this great high priest is a high priest that can relate to us, that has walked the journey of humanness with us, that this great high priest is able not only to be with us, but to restore us. And this is the path of life that our collect speaks about today, that we have a God of suffering and glory. And it is this juxtaposition of living with us in our suffering that allows God's glory to meet with us. But in the Gospel of John, the moment of glorification is the moment on the cross. The moment when God's glory is revealed to the world is that moment when we see a broken and wounded Jesus on the cross. What is that telling us? It is telling us that the glory of God is the love of God for God's creation, the willingness of God to step in and be a part of this thing called life. Now, I don't know where you are in your circumstance today, But what I do know is that this whole COVID time has been a very traumatic period for everybody. I don't know about you, but I am seriously COVID fatigued. And what we do know is that this COVID is going to be with us for a while. And so this fatigue that we feel is not like something that will go away tomorrow. And in this time of COVID, I think that our relationships have come under deep strain and stress. Not just in the family home, but relationships with our colleagues, relationships with our friends, relationships just generally are experiencing an extreme amount of stress. And in this time, we have lost loved ones. Today, we sit in church and we will pray later for Mrs. Water, who has just lost a son. And so we are living in a time where the hope that we need is so desperate. And God is saying to us today, in all your despair, in all your brokenness, I am present. I seek to be with you. And I seek that my grace meets you in that place. And so I'd like to end with sharing with you something very practical, because as you know, my mom's going to watch the sermon later, and she's going to say, my child, please, you were so heavenly high, you were earthly no good. Over this time of COVID, I have found a very powerful prayer. Because remember that the role of the high priest, the role of any priest, is to pray and intercede for God's people. And the powerful prayer I have found is very simple. 3 words. Jesus, 4 words, I can't count. Jesus, take the wheel. Jesus, take the wheel. And I offer this to you as you go into the week ahead. Whatever it is that is coming, God has already gone before you. And you have a high priest who intercedes for you, not from the perspective of someone who is better than you, but from the perspective of someone who deeply loves you, who bled and died for you. And so when you feel overwhelmed and you feel like you can't anymore, pray this prayer. Jesus, take the wheel. In the name of Christ. Amen.